Scrolls and blueprints. Scrolls and blueprints that you find in the game can help you cook things at the cooking pot or craft things at the workbench to help you in battle or in the forest. Some scrolls or blueprints require that you have a certain amount of points to be able to install. Some require none to install and cook or craft. Scrolls and blueprints are randomly given out while you're going about the game, doing various things or completing certain tasks. First, we're going to have a look at scrolls. What they are, what they do, and how to get them. Apple pie recipe. The apple pie recipe allows you to make apple pies, which restore 200 energy points. To get the apple pie recipe scroll, it is randomly given out after trading in servants to become arrow makers at the arrow factory. To install the recipe, say use apple pie recipe. You don't need any points at the cooking pot to begin making apple pies, and it can possibly raise your cooking skill points up to 15. To make an apple pie at the cooking pot, it requires 10 apples. Berry stew recipe. You can find the berry stew recipe randomly that is given out after a random battle during a combat tournament. It requires no cooking points to begin making. Simply say use berry stew recipe to install. It can raise your cooking points up to 15. To make a berry stew, it costs 10 raspberries, 10 blackberries, 2 boar meat, and 3 mushrooms. Crusty bread recipe. You can find the crusty bread recipe in the Dark Tower. It requires no skill points to start cooking at the cooking pot. It can possibly raise your skill points up to 15 at the cooking pot. To make a crusty bread, it requires 4 barley. Simply say use crusty bread recipe to install. Fried mushroom recipe. You can find the fried mushroom recipe after taking potions at the bar. It is randomly given out. It needs no skill points for the cooking pot to install. Simply say use fried mushroom recipe to install it. It can bring your cooking pot skill points up to 15. Fried mushrooms. To make it, it requires 5 mushrooms. Carrot bread recipe. You can find the carrot bread recipe scroll at the order hall after giving a gold donation. It is randomly given out. It requires 5 points at the cooking pot to be able to install. To make carrot bread, it requires 4 crusty bread and 10 carrots. Salad of Resurrection recipe. You can find this randomly after signing up for a hunting tournament. It requires 5 points at the cooking pot to install. Simply say use Salad of Resurrection recipe to install. It can bring your cooking pot points up to 20. It requires 5 herbs, 2 apples, and 2 carrots to make a salad at the cooking pot. Berry juice recipe. The berry juice recipe could be found by participating in the night's games. After hearing the results of the night's games, you may be approached to solve a riddle. If you get the riddle correct, you will receive the recipe. It costs 10 skill points at the cooking pot to install and can raise your skills at the cooking pot up to 25. It requires 15 raspberries and 15 blackberries to make berry juice. Wolf bait recipe. To find the wolf bait recipe, you must finish in the top 3 in a hunting tournament. It is not guaranteed you'll get one at this point, it is randomly given out. It costs 10 points at the cooking pot to install. To make wolf bait at the cooking pot, it requires 20 orc meat, 1 apple pie, and 5 mushrooms. Dragon meat pie recipe. This could be found after you donate servants to the School of Servants at the order hall. It is randomly given out. It costs 15 points at the cooking pot to install. To make dragon meat pie, it requires 1 dragon meat and 5 crusty bread. A small meal recipe. This is randomly given out after losing a fight by the king. It requires 15 points at the cooking pot to install and can raise your points up to 25. To make a small meal, it requires 3 mushrooms, 1 boar meat, and 1 apple. Large meal recipe. You can find this in the Dark Tower. It requires 20 cooking points to install and can raise your cooking points up to 35. To make a large meal, it requires a fried mushroom, 3 boar meat, and 2 apples. Dragon meal recipe. This can be found after a random battle during a combat tournament. It costs 25 points to be able to use at the cooking pot or install, and can raise your cooking points up to 45. To make a dragon meal, it requires 20 orc meat and 10 boar meat. Silver bar blueprint. You can find this at the blacksmith by upgrading your armor or sword early. It requires no points at the workbench to install and can raise it up to 15. To make a silver bar, it requires 500 silver arrows. Thorium arrow blueprint. This is randomly given out after you beat Joe at a game of blackjack. It requires no points at the workbench and can raise it up to 15. To make a thorium arrow, it requires 1 shard and 100 silver arrows. Throwing axe blueprint. You can find this in the forest after defeating a throwing axe orc. This is randomly given out. It requires 10 points at the workbench and can raise it to 25. To make a throwing axe, it requires 2 silver bars, which nets you 5 throwing axes. Thorium spear blueprint. You can get this at the blacksmith by upgrading your quarters early. It requires 15 points at the workbench and can raise it up to 30. To make a thorium spear, it requires 1 shard, 5 silver bars, and 100 silver arrows. This will get you 5 thorium spears. Scale shield blueprint. You can randomly find this blueprint by donating gold to the mountaintop. It requires 15 points at the workbench to install and can possibly raise it up to 30 for maximum. To make a scale shield, it requires 25 dragon scales and 10 silver bars. Wolf coat blueprint. You receive a wolf coat blueprint after taking down the Orc King in the Dark Forest. It requires 25 points at the workbench to install and can raise it up to 35. To make a wolf coat, it requires 20 hides and 5 thorium shards. Dragon saddle blueprint. You receive the dragon saddle blueprint after defeating the dragon when he is in his cave. It requires 35 points at the workbench to install and can raise it to 45. To make a dragon saddle, it requires 100 shards, 50 silver bars, and 25 thorium shards. Thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you think. Until next time. May legends be born.